A lamb like you doesn't survive in this business. Keep your mouth shut and stick to mopping floors if you know it's good for you. That's what Captain Raymond Boyle told me in front of the entire narcotics unit 4 months into my transfer. On the day he called a press conference to parade me in handcuffs, I walked in wearing a smile he didn't understand yet. Not. My name is David Okafor. I was 29 years old, and this is the story of the 8 months I spent cleaning floors, running coffee orders, and quietly building the case that ended Captain Boyle's career on live television. I want to tell you something about myself before I go any further because it matters enormously for everything that comes after. I wasn't actually a rookie patrol officer transferred to Ironport PD's narcotics division by ordinary bureaucratic chance. I was a federal agent with the Department of Justice's Office of Public Integrity, embedded undercover through a carefully arranged lateral transfer sent specifically to investigate a pattern of corruption that had been quietly reported through 3 separate anonymous channels over the preceding 2 years. I'd spent 6 years with the Bureau before this assignment, most of it in considerably less dramatic financial forensics work. The kind of career that trains you for exactly this specific patience without ever quite preparing you for how personally exhausting 8 months of sustained humiliation actually feels once you're living inside it, rather than reading about it in the case file. I remember my final briefing before the transfer. My supervisor walking me through the 3 anonymous complaints that had triggered the investigation, each one describing a similar pattern in careful, frightened language from officers unwilling to attach their own names to it. Captain Boyle had run Ironport's narcotics unit for 11 years, building a reputation as the department's most aggressive, most decorated commander, a reputation that, according to the intelligence I'd been briefed on before my transfer, rested considerably more on skimming seized drug money and extorting protection payments from the very gangs he claimed to be dismantling than on any actual policing. His public reputation, I want to be clear, was genuinely formidable. He'd received 2 mayoral commendations, appeared regularly in local news coverage praising his unit's seizure numbers, and cultivated over more than a decade exactly the kind of untouchable local credibility that makes anonymous internal complaints considerably harder to act on through ordinary channels. That specific credibility was precisely why my assignment required the kind of long-term, patient embedding that 8 months actually demands. My briefing team spent nearly 3 weeks preparing my cover identity before the actual transfer, constructing a patrol record detailed enough to survive scrutiny from a man who, I was warned repeatedly, had a considerable talent for detecting anything that felt slightly inauthentic. I remember one final session, 2 days before my transfer date, where my case supervisor asked me directly whether I was prepared for the specific psychological toll of sustained, personal contempt over an extended timeline rather than the shorter, more contained undercover assignments I'd handled previously. I told her I was. I understood 8 months later exactly how much I hadn't fully appreciated what that question was actually asking me to prepare for. Asked, I arrived at the unit with a cover story built carefully around a genuine, if unremarkable, 4-year patrol record transferred into what appeared to be a routine departmental reassignment. Boyle decided, within my first week, exactly what kind of officer I was going to be treated as, and he never once revised that assessment for the following 8 months. I remember my first morning briefing with the unit standing at the back of a room while Boyle introduced the day's assignments, watching him glance at me exactly once, dismissively, before moving on to matters he clearly considered more important. He didn't bother learning my full name for nearly 3 weeks, referring to me instead as the transfer, in front of the rest of the unit, a small deliberate erasure I recognized immediately as part of a broader pattern rather than simple forgetfulness. He assigned me almost exclusively to evidence room cleanup, coffee runs, and the overnight desk shift nobody else in the unit wanted. The specific combination of tasks designed to communicate without ever needing to say it explicitly that I mattered considerably less than everyone else wearing the same uniform. I spent considerable portions of those 8 months alone in that evidence room at 2 in the morning, cataloging seized property nobody else wanted to touch, developing, gradually, an intimate familiarity with exactly how the unit's paperwork actually worked, which turned out to be considerably more valuable to my actual assignment than any field operation Boyle might have assigned me to instead. I want to be honest that I didn't understand, in those early weeks, exactly how useful his contempt for me was going to become. I simply endured it, the way the assignment required, documenting quietly while appearing to have given up entirely. "A lamb like you doesn't survive in this business," she told me, the first time I asked, cautiously, whether I might be assigned to an actual field operation. "Keep your mouth shut and stick to mopping floors if you know what's good for you." He said some version of that sentence often, over those 8 months, usually in front of the rest of the unit, always with the specific casual cruelty of a man who'd learned over 11 years of running that division that nobody was going to correct him for it. I remember one particular briefing, roughly 2 months in, when a junior detective made a small joke at my expense about my coffee running duties and watched Boyle laugh along with genuine warmth. The specific warmth he never once extended toward me directly, reserved entirely for people he considered worth his actual attention. I want to tell you honestly how difficult it was, absorbing that treatment for 8 months while maintaining a cover identity that required me to appear genuinely defeated by it. I had spent years trained for exactly this kind of long-term undercover assignment, and I still found myself, some nights, needing considerable discipline to remember that the humiliation was data, not a verdict on my actual worth. I called my sister most weekends during that assignment, unable to tell her any specifics, simply needing to hear a voice from outside the particular reality I was living inside 5 days a week. She asked me once, gently, whether the new job was going well. I told her it was fine. Difficult, but fine. The same small dishonesty I imagine most people in situations like mine eventually learn to tell the people who love them, unable to explain the actual shape of what they're carrying without compromising the entire reason they're carrying it. I want to tell you why I chose this particular career, because I think it matters for understanding how I managed 8 months of sustained humiliation without losing sight of why I'd accepted the assignment in the first place. My own father served 26 years as a patrol officer in a considerably smaller department, and I watched him, growing up, navigate a culture that occasionally protected people who shouldn't have been protected, simply because raising concerns formally felt more dangerous to your own career than staying quiet ever did. I don't think he ever fully forgave himself for some of the things he stayed quiet about over those 26 years, and I understood, choosing this specific career path, that I wanted to be the kind of officer who eventually gave people like him somewhere safer to bring exactly that discomfort. I called him the night the story broke publicly, the first time in 8 months I'd been able to tell him anything specific about the actual work I'd been doing. He was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then he said something I'd held on to since. I spent half my career watching men like Boyle and telling myself there was nothing I could do about it. I'm glad you decided there was. Captured the edge. I documented everything carefully during those 8 months. A running log of financial irregularities I noticed during evidence room cleanup duty, seizure amounts that didn't match the numbers eventually logged into the system, drug quantities that shrank slightly between confiscation and formal cataloging, patterns that, individually, might have looked like ordinary sloppy paperwork, but that, compiled together, told a considerably more deliberate story. I kept that documentation in a series of encrypted files, updated each night after my overnight desk shift ended, cross-referencing seizure reports against the unit's internal financial records with the same patient, methodical attention I'd once applied to considerably less personally exhausting forensic accounting cases. The pattern that emerged over those months was consistent enough that I understood, well before the frame attempt ever happened, exactly how large the underlying operation actually was. I also built carefully a small network of trusted contacts within the department, officers who'd noticed the same irregularities I had but lacked either the standing or the courage to raise them formally, given Boyle's considerable influence over promotions, assignments, and disciplinary reviews throughout the entire division. The breaking point came in the 7th month when a drug deal Boyle had personally arranged, using department resources to extort a payment from a mid-level trafficking operation, went badly wrong. The trafficking group, feeling shortchanged by Boyle's demanded cut, refused to pay the full amount, and a considerable sum of both cash and product went missing during the resulting confusion, missing in a way that would have required Boyle to explain to his own superiors exactly why an off-book arrangement had fallen apart so visibly. I learned about the specifics of that failed arrangement only gradually, piecing together fragments from evidence room paperwork and overheard hallway conversations over the following several days. What I understood clearly, almost immediately, was that Boyle's usual composure had shifted into something considerably more agitated, a man managing a problem he couldn't simply intimidate his way out of the way he handled most other obstacles in his career. Boyle needed someone to blame for that missing money and product, someone whose career and credibility mattered little enough that sacrificing them wouldn't cost him anything meaningful. He chose me, I understood immediately, precisely because 8 months of careful humiliation had convinced him I had no standing left to fight back with. Habituation. Habby planted a sealed bag of narcotics in my locker on a Tuesday evening, timing it deliberately for a shift when the evidence room's camera system was scheduled for routine maintenance, a detail I recognized instantly as evidence of exactly how carefully premeditated this particular frame had actually been. I found out of the locker search the following morning from a junior officer who clearly felt uncomfortable delivering the news. Avoiding my eyes as he told me, Boyle wanted to see me immediately. I remember the specific, deliberate calm I forced into my own posture walking toward that office, understanding that whatever came next would matter considerably more than anything that had happened over the preceding 8 months combined. He called me into his office the following morning, two other loyal officers positioned near the door, and told me, plainly, that narcotics matching the missing shipment had been discovered in my locker during a routine inspection. Ugh. Here's how this works, he told me. You sign a confession admitting you diverted the product for personal resale. You take the internal disciplinary hit, maybe some reduced criminal exposure if you cooperate fully. Or I make sure the full weight of an actual prosecution lands on you. And I promise you, David, I have connections in this city considerably more useful to that outcome than anything you've got working in your favor. I want to describe what I was thinking in that office because it's the specific moment I understood, with total clarity, that this frame attempt was actually the gift my entire 8-month assignment had been waiting for. I was wearing a concealed recording device that morning, standard equipment I'd carried every single day of that assignment, capturing in real time Boyle's own voice describing the coercion, the fabricated evidence, and, in a detail he clearly didn't intend to reveal so specifically, a passing reference to keeping us quiet the way we kept the Delaquad payment quiet last spring. A sentence that would matter considerably more than he understood in that moment. I remember sitting across that desk, maintaining exactly the frightened, cornered posture the moment actually called for, while some separate, considerably calmer part of my attention cataloged every specific detail he was volunteering, understanding that each unnecessary sentence he added to his own threat was simply more evidence accumulating against him in real time. I signed nothing that day. I told him I needed time to consider his offer, exactly the response a genuinely cornered, frightened officer would give, and left his office with a recording that represented, in a single 11-minute conversation, more actionable evidence than the previous 8 months combined had managed to produce. I called Deputy Director Nwosu from my car in the parking garage less than 10 minutes later, my hands, I'll admit honestly, not quite steady yet, and played her the recording over a secure line before I'd even fully processed everything I'd just captured. She was quiet for a long moment after it finished. David, she finally said, I need you to understand exactly how significant this is. This changes the entire timeline of what we're building. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed, because I think they matter more than the dramatic conclusion everyone eventually saw play out. I spent those weeks in genuine sustained fear, understanding that Boyle intended to escalate formal charges against me regardless of whether I signed his proposed confession, and understanding, simultaneously, that revealing my actual identity too early might compromise the broader case my supervisors were still building around the full scope of his operation. I remember specific nights during that period, unable to sleep, running through every possible way the timeline could still go wrong, understanding that 8 months of careful, patient work could still unravel if Boyle moved against me formally before Deputy Director Nwasu's office had assembled everything necessary to act decisively. I kept my documentation backed up in 3 separate secure locations during those weeks, a level of caution that probably exceeded what was strictly necessary, though I found the redundancy itself considerably calming during a period that offered very little else in the way of comfort. My supervisor, a careful, exacting woman named Deputy Director Patricia Nwasu, told me during our nightly check-in calls that the recording I'd obtained, combined with the financial irregularities I'd documented over 8 months, was strong enough to move forward, but that the timing needed to account for exactly how Boyle intended to formally proceed against me, since acting too early risked losing the opportunity to catch any additional corruption the frame attempt might still expose. She reminded me, more than once during those calls, that patience during exactly this kind of pressure was a specific skill that separated a good long-term undercover operation from one that collapsed prematurely under its own accumulated tension. I found her steadiness during those weeks considerably more valuable than she probably realized. A fixed point I could orient myself around in the actual daily reality of continuing to report to Boyle's unit, knowing what I knew, became genuinely difficult to sustain. That opportunity arrived roughly 3 weeks later when Boyle, apparently confident I had no meaningful way to fight back, decided to turn my planned arrest into a public spectacle, calling a press conference to announce, with considerable self-congratulation, the department's discovery of a Klav Asian, the department's discovery of a corrupt officer operating within our own ranks, framing my supposed arrest as evidence of his own department's rigorous internal standards. Deputy Director Nwosu told me the night before that press conference that this was exactly the moment we'd been waiting for. Boyle had, without realizing it, built his own downfall's public stage for us, gathering every major local news camera in the city into a single room at a single moment, entirely of his own design. I remember the specific conversation we had that evening, going over the exact sequence of what would happen once I walked into that room, Nuwasu emphasizing, more than once, that I needed to let him finish enough of his own remarks that the eventual reversal would land with maximum undeniable clarity for the cameras already rolling. The press conference took place on a bright Thursday morning, Boyle standing at a podium in his dress uniform, flanked by department officials, describing for the assembled cameras the diligent internal investigation that had supposedly uncovered my alleged corruption. I stood outside that room for several minutes beforehand, going through the same specific breathing technique I'd once used to manage far more physically dangerous situations earlier in my career, understanding that walking through that door represented the actual culmination of 8 months I'd never quite let myself imagine reaching and ending this public. I walked into that room roughly 8 minutes into his remarks, wearing a smile he clearly didn't understand yet, considerably more composed than the frightened officer he expected to see led in by uniformed escorts. I watched his face shift in real time from confident self-congratulation into a specific, rapidly dawning confusion, the exact expression of a man realizing several seconds too late that something about this carefully staged moment had already stopped following his script. I reached into my jacket and produced my actual credentials, holding them up clearly enough for every camera in that room to capture without ambiguity. "My name is David Okafor," I said, "and I'm a federal agent with the Department of Justice's Office of Public Integrity. I've been embedded within this department for 8 months, investigating a pattern of corruption within Captain Boyle's command that includes extortion of drug trafficking organizations, evidence tampering, and, as of 3 weeks ago, an attempt to coerce a false confession from me personally in order to cover for his own theft of seized funds." I watched every camera in that room shift, almost in unison, away from the podium's prepared backdrop and directly onto Boyle's face, capturing for a national audience the exact moment his entire public identity collapsed in real time. I remember the specific silence that followed my statement, a room full of reporters who'd arrived expecting a routine, self-congratulatory press conference, suddenly understanding they were witnessing something considerably larger unfold. Live, several of them visibly scrambling to adjust their own coverage in real time. Federal agents entered the room from 2 separate doors simultaneously, moving toward the podium with the specific, practiced coordination of people executing a plan considerably larger than the press conference currently understood. Captain Raymond Boyle, one of the lead agents, announced, her voice carrying clearly across a room that had gone almost completely silent. "You're under federal arrest for extortion, evidence tampering, and coercion of a federal officer based on evidence collected over the past 8 months of investigation." Boyle's legs actually gave out slightly, an agent catching his arm before he fully lost his balance. I watched the same officials who'd stood proudly beside him moments earlier take several visible steps backward, putting careful, deliberate distance between themselves and a man whose career had just ended in front of every camera in the city. I stood near the podium for a long moment after the agent secured him, watching a considerable commotion unfold around us, reporters shouting questions nobody was yet prepared to answer, department officials retreating toward the exits as quickly as professional decorum allowed. I felt standing there a strange suspended calm, the specific sensation of watching 8 months of accumulated tension finally completely release all at once. The footage from that press conference ran on every major national news channel within the hour and continued running in various edited forms for the better part of a week afterward. I didn't watch most of it myself, understanding that whatever the cameras had captured mattered considerably less to me personally than the 8 months of quiet work that had actually produced it. I did watch it once, weeks later, mostly to confirm for myself that the moment had unfolded the way I remembered it, and found, watching it, that my own memory had been accurate almost to the second. Deputy Director Nwasu played the recording of Boyle's coercion attempt publicly that same afternoon, released as part of the Department of Justice's formal announcement, his own voice, captured with total clarity, describing exactly how he intended to frame me and exactly what he expected me to sign in exchange for reduced consequences. I want to tell you about the twist in his story now, the one that mattered considerably more than Boyle's arrest itself, and the one that emerged only once forensic analysts finished processing the full 11-minute recording several days later. Buried in that recording in the specific sentence Boyle had used about keeping this quiet the way we kept the Delacroix payment quiet last spring, investigators found a reference that led, over the following weeks, to a considerably larger discovery than anyone on my original investigative team had anticipated. I remember Deputy Director Nwosu calling me personally to walk through what a forensic analyst had uncovered, her voice carrying a specific energy I hadn't heard from her throughout the entire 8 months preceding that call. "David," she said, "I don't think you understand yet exactly how much bigger this just became." The Delacroix payment, it turned out, referred to a six-figure sum extorted from a trafficking organization 8 months earlier, a portion of which, financial records eventually confirmed, had been routed directly to Deputy Chief Neil Corrigan, Boyle's own direct superior, in exchange for ensuring that internal audits of the Narcotics Division's seizure records never received the scrutiny they actually required. Boyle hadn't been operating at the top of his own corruption. He'd been a well-compensated middle layer in a considerably larger arrangement, one that Deputy Director Nwasu's team had suspected existed for months, but had never been able to conclusively trace until his own careless reference, made in a moment of overconfidence, handed investigators the exact thread they needed. I sat with that revelation for a long time after Nwasu's call ended, understanding that the specific arrogance which had made Boyle so effective at humiliating me for 8 months, the same certainty that he could say anything he wanted without consequence, had ultimately produced the exact unnecessary detail that unraveled an entire chain of corruption running considerably higher than his own office. Deputy Chief Corrigan was arrested 9 days later, the investigation expanding to encompass nearly 2 years of systemic corruption spanning multiple units within Ironport PD, considerably larger than the single captain story the initial press conference footage had suggested to a national audience watching it unfold live. I sat through both men's arraignments, understanding watching them exactly how deep a pattern 8 months of quiet, patient documentation had actually uncovered, considerably deeper than even my own supervisors had initially suspected when they first assigned me to that narcotics division. I want to tell you about the officers I'd quietly built relationships with during those 8 months, the ones who'd noticed Boyle's irregularities but lacked the standing to raise them formally. Several of them testified before the federal grand jury, their accounts corroborating patterns I documented independently, giving prosecutors a case considerably stronger than my own recording alone could have provided. I'd approached each of them carefully during my assignment, never revealing my actual purpose, simply listening during quiet moments when their own frustration with Boyle's culture surfaced naturally in ordinary conversation. I remember specifically how difficult it was, some evenings, listening to a colleague describe some new irregularity they'd noticed without being able to tell them I already knew that I was actively building the exact case their frustration was quietly asking someone, anyone, to finally build. One of them, a patrol sergeant named Elena Vasquez, told me afterward that she'd assumed, for years, that reporting Boyle's behavior to any official channel would simply end her own career rather than his, given how thoroughly he'd embedded himself into the department's power structure. I kept a private log too, she told me. I just never had anywhere safe to actually bring it. I told her Deputy Director Nwasu's office would want to see it, and it became, eventually, one of the more valuable pieces of corroborating evidence in the entire case. We met for coffee several times in the months following the arrests, comparing the specific shape of a caution we'd each carried separately for years without ever quite recognizing the other person was carrying an equivalent version of it. She told me she'd nearly transferred out of the department entirely twice, convinced nothing would ever meaningfully change under Boyle's continued leadership. I told her I understood exactly that particular exhaustion, having spent 8 months learning to carry a considerably more deliberate version of the same weight. Boyle pleaded guilty 14 months later to a reduced set of federal charges as part of a negotiated agreement, receiving a considerable prison sentence and a permanent lifetime ban from any future law enforcement employment. Deputy Chief Corrigan received a longer sentence, the broader corruption case ultimately implicating 3 additional officers across 2 other divisions, each of whom had been quietly receiving a share of the extortion proceeds in exchange for looking away from irregularities they'd noticed in their own areas of responsibility. I attended Boyle's sentencing hearing, curious, honestly, to see him in a room where he no longer controlled a single element of the proceedings, considerably smaller and considerably more subdued than the man who'd once told an entire unit that a lamb like me couldn't survive in his business. He didn't look at me once during the entire hearing. I found I didn't particularly need him to. I remember the specific detail of his attorney's closing statement, describing Boyle's considerable contributions to the department over 11 years. A description I found almost fascinating in its narrow accuracy, considering exactly what those contributions had actually consisted of once the full case became public. The judge, to her credit, seemed to find the same detail considerably less persuasive than Boyle's attorney had hoped, delivering a sentence that reflected the actual scope of what he'd built rather than the reputation he'd spent 11 years carefully constructing around it. Ironport PD underwent a considerable federal oversight period following the arrests, a new narcotics division leadership structure, and a formally mandated internal audit process considerably more rigorous than anything Boyle's command had ever permitted to examine his own operation. The new leadership, I understand from officers I stayed in touch with, implemented a formal, protected internal reporting channel specifically designed to give officers like Sergeant Vasquez somewhere safe to bring exactly the kind of private documentation she'd carried, unheard for years before our case ever surfaced. I don't know yet how durable that particular reform will prove to be over the considerably longer timeline institutional change actually requires. I know it exists now where it didn't before, and I understand exactly how much that specific existence matters to the next officer who notices something wrong and needs somewhere to actually bring it. I think about that whole 8 months often and what it actually taught me. Not that undercover work is glamorous, because I want to be honest that very little of it actually was. Most days, simply an exercise in absorbing calculated humiliation while documenting patterns nobody else was positioned to see clearly yet. What it taught me was something quieter than that. Corruption like Boyle's survives specifically by convincing everyone around it that speaking up costs more than staying silent. It took 8 months of patient, careful documentation to prove that assumption wrong in a way loud enough for cameras to actually capture. I think, too, about the specific moment I first understood that his contempt for me was actually a strategic gift rather than simply an injury to absorb. It took me considerably longer than 8 months to fully internalize that reframe, and I don't want to suggest it made the daily experience of enduring it any less genuinely difficult. I think there's a version of this story that skips past that difficulty in favor of the satisfying ending, and I think that version does a disservice to anyone currently living through their own version of Boyle's contempt without yet knowing whether their own ending will resolve as cleanly as mine happened to. I think, too, about Sergeant Vasquez's private log, kept for years with nowhere safe to bring it, and about how many other quiet, careful records like hers exist right now in departments across this country, waiting for someone to finally build the kind of case that gives them somewhere safe to matter. I don't believe every story like this one gets the specific dramatic ending might happen to receive. I believe considerably more of them start exactly the way this one did, with someone deciding, quietly, that documentation was worth a risk regardless of the outcome. I've thought considerably in the months since about how differently this entire case might have unfolded if Boyle had simply been slightly more disciplined in that 11-minute conversation, if he'd never mentioned the Delacroix payment at all, confident enough in his own power that he saw no need for caution even while committing to tape the exact crime that would eventually end his career. I don't take that specific carelessness for granted. I understand exactly how many considerably more careful versions of Boyle are still operating right now in departments across this country, precisely because they've never made the one unnecessary sentence that turns quiet suspicion into an undeniable case. If you've ever been told by someone with more power than you that keeping your mouth shut was the only sensible option available, I understand that particular pressure better than most people ever will. I don't have a universal formula for answering it. I only know that the people willing to keep quiet records, patiently at real personal risk, are usually the reason corruption like this ever actually gets fully exposed. I don't want anyone listening to this to walk away believing that only federal agents with a hidden badge and a recording device can actually stand up to someone like Boyle. Most people facing exactly this kind of pressure don't have my particular set of resources, and I think it would be dishonest of me to suggest my ending is the realistic outcome most people should expect from simply enduring quietly and hoping. What I do believe is available to almost anyone is the smaller, more achievable version of what Sergeant Vasquez was already doing long before I ever arrived in that unit. Keeping an honest record, even without knowing yet where it might eventually matter, so that if a safer moment to bring it forward ever does arrive, the truth is already sitting there, documented, waiting. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of a moment someone with power over you assumes your silence was guaranteed, I'd love to hear about it. I hope your own version of that assumption gets proven just as wrong, whatever shape that eventually takes for you. I still work with Deputy Director Nwasser's office on considerably quieter cases most people will never hear turned into a story like this one. She told me once, not long after Boyle's sentencing, that she'd chosen me for that assignment specifically because my file suggested I understood the difference between patience and passivity, a distinction she said mattered more to long-term undercover work than almost any other quality she screened for. I think about that distinction often on the harder days this work still occasionally produces. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around. There's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.